much. Nice to see you all. As I'm looking at your faces, I recognize a lot of you as like the COVID crew, right? Where I have no idea where any of you are from or where any of you live, really. I just remember seeing your cubes at different times during COVID, and it feels really heartwarming because it was a hard time, but it made it so beautiful that we created this little community together. So anyway, I see you, Angel. I see you, Leanne. It's so nice to see you, Brenda. It's nice to see all of you and remember a lot of your faces from these times. So anyway, very happy to see you. We'll start with refuge in Bodhichitta. Sangye Chudon Sogi Chunam Lae Jancho Badu Dani Gapsuchi Dagi Chunyan Ki Pe Sonam Ki Rola Benjia Sangye Drupa Sho Sangye Chudon Sogi Chunam Lae Jancho Badu Dani Gapsuchi Dagi Chunyan Ki Pe Sonam Ki Rola Benji Sange Rupa Sho Sange Chudon Sugi Chunam La Janchu Badu Dani Kapsuchi Dagi Chunyangi Pe Sonam Gi Rola Benji Sange Rupa Sho. And so just take a minute and let refuge and bodhicitta connect. Really feeling that support from your inner refuge, your own positive states of mind, outer refuge, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And from that place of feeling supported and nourished, both internally and externally, thinking of altruism. May I bring benefit to others. May I do whatever I can to facilitate their awakening. Whatever they're ready for, whatever they're open to, may I be skillful. Okay. All right. So we'll get into, again, what we covered last time, just very briefly about what it takes to break a vow. And then we're going to go through some different perspectives on these vows and then go through a few more of the root vows and do a meditation. So that's the plan for today. Bit of meditation, bit of commentary, bit of context. So I just wanted to review that one section briefly about what it takes to break the root vows, just so it's really clear, because in one way it can make you relieved because it actually takes a lot. And so this is the quote from Sixth Session Guru Yoga. Those of you that have highest yoga tantra will be familiar with this. So it says, not seeing these as faults, not giving up the wish to engage in them, doing them with delight and satisfaction, and having no shame or consideration. All four binding factors must be present to commit 16 of these root downfalls. But for holding wrong views and giving up bodhicitta, they are not needed. I will guard myself from these 18 root downfalls. So colloquially, we could say the first one is like not seeing the transgression as a mistake and or not knowing any better. So this is interesting because it feels kind of like, oh, well, it's just innocent though. Why is it a transgression? And one of the understandings in Buddhism is that if you don't understand something to be a transgression, it's quite dangerous. It's hard for you to prevent doing it. So it's much better if you know what a fault is, even if you keep doing it, than if you don't know what a fault is altogether. Because then there's no mechanism whatsoever to stop that momentum. So that first one, not knowing any better or not realizing how heavy it is or how important it is, this is remedied just by study and some deep thought, and also examining any baggage you might have come into this life with, or from this life, maybe from other religions that maybe have a harsher worldview, where we find these escape routes when we've made mistakes because we're so consumed with guilt or fears of punishment or fears of judgment. And if we think about guilt, it's a little bit like if you do the wrong thing, you make up for it by feeling bad, which is a very strange way of thinking of behavior correction, right? You think I pay for doing the wrong thing by feeling bad. In Buddhism, there is no need to feel bad, right? You recognize regret in a kind of in an intellectual way, in a whoops, that was not what I meant to do. Not therefore I'm bad, or I can keep doing it as long as I feel bad about it. That kind of like little escape route that we do with guilt sometimes. So regret, not guilt, very important here. Um, and educating yourself about having the vows, even just reading them through sometimes, it keeps them a lot more forefront. And then you'll avoid this first branch or this first binding factor. The second is being careless with making the mistake again. There's no behavior change attempted or even considered. So, say we're talking about that first one, praising oneself and belittling others. You know it's important, you recognize yourself doing it, and you're like, oops, good. But then you do nothing to change your behavior, right? There's no just kind of sitting with, why do I do that? When do I do that? What are ways where I can trust my mindfulness enough to say, no, I'm not going to do that in this context anymore? What are like tiny plans I can start to make? Um, how can I unravel those underlying things like maybe insecurity that drive me to make this behavior? So that second one, it's like you really have to sit with what does it mean to have noticed a transgression? Right? What does it mean? And once you've noticed it, really notice it from a much deeper perspective of the whys and the whens, but not personalizing it, not making it too like a character flaw. You're just seeing it as a something to work on. Yeah, like a training. Yeah. Um, so then being happy to make the mistake is the third binding factor. And this is kind of like thinking of oneself as naughty or mischievous, like liking that. And this is maybe less common, but maybe we've seen this in our friends and we don't see it in ourselves where they're doing the wrong thing, cackling like, "Wahaha, I did the wrong thing. Haha, try and catch me." And they feel sort of like naughty and mischievous and like playful and childlike. And a lot of the time it is very benign and it's quite funny and who cares? When it's related to the Bodhisattva vows, it becomes quite dangerous to identify as like a mischief maker because you're kind of downplaying how powerful a promise is, and you're downplaying how significant it is to try and live in this way. And so, Buddhism's not trying to ruin your fun, right? But it just kind of sitting with like, when do we do the wrong thing? Know it's the wrong thing, wanna be working on it, but part of us is kind of like, "You're not the boss of me. I'll do what I like. I'm a naughty character." There's like a tiny rebel in us. Yeah, like a little James Dean or something, I don't know. So, just kind of sitting with, like, what is that rebelliousness about? Because you're really rebelling against your own best intentions. No one is forcing you to take the Bodhisattva vows. Nobody made you do it. It was voluntary. And yet then there's this like little rebellion inside. So that's kind of an interesting one to sit with is when do we do the wrong thing knowingly with a little bit of delight, like a twinkle in the eye that's not the benign one that we think it is. Yeah, so that one's quite interesting. And then the fourth one is not considering the impact on others or your path. So you kind of treat it a little too lightly and forget the purpose of these vows to begin with. And this is where we get the words that are kind of tricky in Buddhism because we're talking about cultivating the positive states of mind of shame and embarrassment, which are horrible things that we don't want to be cultivating from a colloquial sense. But in Buddhism, shame and embarrassment mean something very different. They mean with restraining from negative actions for the sake of others and restraining from negative actions for the sake of seeing yourself as a practitioner. So it's holding yourself to a higher standard than you once did because of how you see yourself now as someone who's really trying a spiritual path. Yeah, and also that kind of consideration of what is my impact on others? I'm making a choice to consider that more often. Like we hope all people have a general civic responsibility, a general sense of politeness, hospitable, whatever. But that's kind of like a behavioral thing to try and get what you want a lot of the time. When you're on the Bodhisattva path, you're really trying to think genuinely, what is my impact on others? Is it a positive impact? Because of course we look to our motivation first. Is my motivation to do no harm? Is my motivation to be kind? But it is also important to consider impact. So if any of you have ever done work around like restorative justice and different kinds of mediation and peace and reconciliation work, sometimes you really have to go to the motivation of the person was important, but the impact is also important. So even if you meant well, if it didn't land well, that's still an important consideration. And so we're not off the hook as Buddhists just because motivation is key and centralized in so many teachings. So if you meant well, but you didn't do well, still kind of having some thought about that. So when we think about those are the four binding factors that are needed to break a bodhisattva vow from the root. In some ways, you realize you've broken more than you thought. In other ways, maybe some of them you're doing really well at. Kind of maybe can adjust your relationship to these vows a little bit. But remember that for 16 of these, you really restore them all by yourself. If all four binding factors are not complete, if just three are complete or two or one, you can restore them all by yourself. Yeah, and the ritual, I think, is at the back of the book. It's just a short verse that you repeat 3 times, thinking it's in front of the Buddha. So that's good to know. Of course, for giving up bodhicitta and holding wrong views, those are very heavy. But when you see these, what kind of reaction do you have, or what bring comes up for you?
Well, I'll just say hi,
Sure, yeah.
John. Okay, I was just going to say having it rephrased a different way actually made me think differently compared to the original kind of statements that are said. So it, now I just got to think more again.
Yeah,
Well, I think a
yeah,
little devious one, probably not, but I get that, kind of somebody being mischief,
yeah.
devious, I guess it is. Anyway, I just had to rethink things, so just hearing it phrased differently, and I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, and it's good to flag that because, it's important to look at the traditional commentaries of the texts in tandem with the root verses, and then to really work it through and say, if I were to explain it, how would it
Yeah,
sound out of my mouth? Because
yeah,
it's a whole other way of processing information. So you're not making it up or making it up from scratch. You're putting it into your own words, and that develops that wisdom of contemplation. We have
nice.
the wisdom of hearing, wisdom of contemplation, wisdom of meditation. That middle one really gets developed by different forms of study. And
Yeah,
one of those forms is really like, okay, I'm reading this, but how would I say it? And it still mean the same thing. And it really helps it go deeper. Yeah,
nice.
John and then Lars.
I think you answered my question. I was considering like how do we internalize that, but it's just study and reflection and just kind of meditating on it. That makes sense. So thank you.
Yeah, repeat, repeat. Yeah, Lars.
Regarding question number two, realizing that it's not really conducive for whatever I'm trying to achieve. How much time afterwards? I mean, do I have to do it at the same time that I would be, I mean, say, oh, that's not good, or in the evening purification? I mean, sort of like it's like a Hail Mary. I can always just do a purification. I'm off the hook. I mean, where do we land this one?
Yeah, I mean, it brings up an important point because there's things that are natural misdeeds that are negative karma, whether you have a vow about them or not. And then there are things that are sort of double powerful because you've made a promise. So take something simple like you have the refuge lay vow not to kill. Well, even if you don't have that vow, killing is still negative karma, right? So say you were cleaning your kitchen and you wiped up all the ants. Yeah, and you knew you were killing all the ants when you were wiping up in the kitchen, and you're like, "Oh, not ideal. What to do? Life, ha." But then later you're like, "Oh, actually, I have a vow not to kill, and killing is a misdeed. I just took what is most important to that creature. Now I've created a difficult karma between us. When we meet again, it's not going to go well. I've created the cause for all sorts of illness in my future. It's not good for them. It's not good for me. It's not good in general. Oh gosh. Okay. So when you're sitting and doing Vajrasattva, you are purifying the negative karma of killing, but that doesn't restore the vow not to kill. Right? To restore the vow not to kill is a different process. So for the Bodhisattva vows, it's a process you can do by yourself, and it is just reciting that verse. And if you didn't break all four branches, easy to do at the end of the day. So that's that twofold thing of if it's a natural misdeed, you need to purify the negative karma. But if it's something you have a vow about, also do some restoration. So to do both. So at the end of the day is fine. Just make sure you're hitting both notes, the purification and the restoration, if it's about a vow. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. So like that, yeah, Brenda, go ahead.
Just following on from that, the example you gave is one that I'm very aware of wiping the counter down and out go the ants. I don't do it deliberately, but every so often I make a mistake and I haven't noticed that the ant was there, and then suddenly my cloth has gone over it. Obviously I didn't want to do that. I need to be more careful. I need to go more slowly, blah, 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 blah. But any advice on that one?
That's a case where it's not as heavy because you didn't mean to.
Hmm.
It's like in the first case, you're wiping over the ants. It's not like you're thinking, I want to decimate ants. You're thinking, I want to clean my counter and they're in my way. But you see that they're in your way and you know that you're killing them. That is a heavy karma. But when you wipe and you didn't notice they were there until afterwards, then you're just like, oh, darling, I'm sorry. And you can just quickly do some mantras and blow on their body, and it can really impact their positive rebirth. But it's not the same heaviness for you because you didn't mean to.
Okay.
So intention is important, whether it's a vow or it's a natural misdeed. Intention is still very, very important in all of this piece in terms of what makes something heavy or light. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. Yeah, other thoughts about what it takes to break? Clear enough? Now just a matter of getting on with it, I suppose. Um, there is another way of viewing the Bodhisattva vows, and this is a very graphic photo of when I first took Gelongma vows. When you take Gelongma vows or Gelong vows in the Chinese tradition, you get these 3 burn marks on the top of your head. You can't usually see them when my hair is this long, but right after a haircut, you can still see the scars, even though it's many years later. But the 3 represent restraining from harmful actions, accumulating wholesome actions, and working to benefit others. So they can all be summarized as this. And in some traditions, this is what they say is the Bodhisattva vows, is this 3 trainings. So this is from Geshe Tashi Sering, who some of you may know from the London Center. And he was at Saramay as well. So he says, for us, the first step is to restrain from harmful actions. If we cannot do that, then the second and third steps are quite difficult. The first and second, restraining oneself from harmful actions and accumulating wholesome deeds, are technically what is called ripening one's mental continuum. These are mainly for our own sake. We need to be prepared because if we're not ready, how can we benefit others? So Lama Tsongkhapa says that without subduing one's own negative emotions, there is no way to subdue or help eliminate other people's disturbing emotions. That is very clear. So this is interesting that in the Pure Land tradition specifically, they do this burning process. For lay people, you sometimes see it on the crook of their elbow. They have 3 little burns. And it's to remember those 3 trainings. It is a little hardcore, right? They're like, that's their nature, so don't burn yourself, please. Um, but when you do this practice, you think that the smell of your burning flesh is a smell offering to hungry ghosts that you're doing at the same time as taking Bodhisattva vows on the basis of having already taken individual liberation Pradamoksha vows. So it's hardcore, yeah. And if you're doing it with a whole bunch of people and everyone's getting burned, you're like, this is intense. Right? So in the Tibetan tradition, we're a little bit chill about some things like that. But it is interesting to think, like, what is a physical touchstone to remember the simplest form of this training? Like, it could be your mala beads. It could be like a little pendant. It could be, favorite little earring, something, for lay people, you can wear jewelry if you want to. But a little mala, even just a wrist mala, if it's something that is not seen as ornament, but is actually seen as touchstone for practice, it can have a similar benefit. So, when I do like this, I remember I'm a nun. I mean, I remember I'm a nun generally, but I remember I'm a nun because no hair. But then my little dots, I remember I also have Bodhisattva vows. And it's a good touchstone. So if there's something that you can bring in that adds that other sensorial element, I really recommend it. I don't recommend burning. It's hardcore. It took months to heal. Right. But lots of people get curious about those dots that they see in the fully ordained nuns because, of course, the tradition is not in the Tibetan tradition. So you have to go to Taiwan or go to Vietnam or go to somewhere where they do full ordination of women and become a hybrid. And their tradition is as soon as you have fresh Pradamoksha vows, then you do your Bodhisattva vows again on that basis and then do this extra practice. So it's interesting to just kind of simplify it into those 3, right? So I'll plop that back up again. If, you're like 18 root vows, 46 secondary offenses, how am I going to remember this all? If you can just keep it to restrain from negative actions or harmful actions, accumulate wholesome actions or positive actions, work to benefit others. Just these 3 does cover the bases. Right? How does that sit with you guys looking at those 3? Even if you were just to kind of pick one as a project for a while, then the second one as a project, then the third one, and just kind of weave them together as mainstays of how you think about yourself in relation to others in the world. It's interesting, yeah? Seems self-evident, straightforward, but it's a powerful life if that's what motivates you. I would say even in the morning, you could just say this to yourself. May I refrain from harmful actions. May I accumulate positive actions. May I work for the welfare of others or the benefit of others. Does that feel comfortable? Yeah. John, go ahead.
Does that relate to the 3 scopes of the path? I can't remember the name of it now.
No, don't make an equivalency that way. Of course, it's all related, but it's
Okay.
not so tidy 1, 2, 3. It's not
Gotcha.
so tidy like that. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
appreciate
this
it.
is all great scope practice that we're talking about. Bodhisattva path is great scope path. But yeah, it's a good question because we have so many lists in the Buddhism.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, so I just wanted to give you some context for where the upcoming commentary is coming from. So I received the oral transmission and commentary of the Bodhisattva Vows from Khensa Rinpoche, Geshe Tashi Tsering, in 2005 at Chenrezig Institute in Australia. So he's not super well known. He was the abbot of Gyume for, 7 years. He taught at Chenrezig Institute for about 20 years, and he's one of those beautiful like antique geshes of that tradition that came out of Tibet. So you can see him here in the center of the group picture, and there's me above him. And then this was kind of the layout in the Gompa where we all kind of sat and studied with our little cute desks. And you can see there's lay people there that joined us as well. So this was kind of the hardcore team at Chenrezig Institute in that time. So the following is mainly from Kensei Rinpoche Geshe Tashi Sering. In future sessions, I might draw on a few other commentaries as well. So where do they come from, right? Generally, these different instructions on the mind of enlightenment can be traced back to India, to the noble being Asanga. And from Asanga, if you trace back further, you get to the protector Maitreya, right? The Buddha of loving kindness. And then in turn, you'll find it in the Buddha's teachings on the Sutra in Unraveling the Intention, sometimes called the Sutra Unraveling the Thought. So this is the sutra that our tradition of Bodhisattva Vows comes from, the Sutra Unraveling the Intention. If you follow the lineage forward from Asanga, then you come to masters like the elder Atisha, who brought this lineage of instructions to Tibet. And of course, Atisha's own teacher, Lama Serlingpa from the Golden Isle, Sumatra. And it is this the lineage by which these instructions come to us. So there are lots of sutras that talk about the Bodhisattva path and the Bodhisattva vows, and they're all very similar, but of course the Buddha taught this to lots of different groups of people. So in other sutras, like the Brahma Net Sutra, there's similar versions found and are utilized in other traditions. So in the Pure Land tradition, for example, their Bodhisattva vows are more likely to be associated with the Brahma Net Sutra. So if you were to read them side by side, you'd be like, yeah, they're talking about the same thing. But there is some variations in how they number things. There's some different ways of positioning different things. So obviously he taught to the audience in front of him. And so it goes with Buddhism when you have a teacher who taught for 40 years all over the place. So yeah, thoughts about that. So ours is coming from the Sutra Unraveling the Thought from the Buddha. If you find variations in the Bodhisattva vows in other traditions, it doesn't mean they're wrong. They're just using a different sutra, which is also from the Buddha. And the point of all of it is, how do you develop merit to become enlightened for the benefit of all? Right? Yeah. How's that sit with you guys? Are there things you've seen in other traditions that you're curious about, or things about the source that you're interested in? Yeah. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Sorry, one more. So what's the difference between merit and karma? I've always wondered that question. Just do they
The
accomplish?
answer is merit is positive karma. Short
Okay,
answer. Yeah,
thanks.
positive karma. Yeah. Yeah. So for those of you that have come across different forms of Buddhism or still like to cross-fertilize different forms of Buddhism, so you don't get tangled, a really good book I wanted to flag is this book by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Venerable Thubten Chodron. It's called Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. And it goes through all of the main teachings in Buddhism and explains, here's how they talk about it in the Pali tradition, here's how they talk about it in the Sanskrit tradition. And it goes back and forth in a really helpful way, because there's some teachings, like on the Four Immeasurable Thoughts, for example, where the way it's explained in one tradition really is quite different than the other tradition. And so it's helpful to understand, like the three jewels, Pali tradition, Sanskrit tradition. It's got all sorts of good stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to flag that. It's helpful. It's helpful. So Buddhism, one teaching, one teacher, many traditions. That's a good one. That's a good one. Okay. So feel confident the Bodhisattva vows came from the Buddha. They're not just a random add-on. One of the reasons I flag this is because the lay vows, you guys, a lot of you have the lay vows, right? Not to kill, not to steal, not to engage in sexual misconduct, not to lie, and then the branch of avoiding intoxicants. So some of you have one of those, two of those, any combination of those. And there's a few of them that, the Buddha gave all of them, but the way they're interpreted did vary over the years. Like, for example, the sexual misconduct vow from the time of the Buddha was just refrain from adultery, right? Don't be a partner poacher, right? Don't allow yourself to be poached, right? Just really straightforward, don't do that. Then subsequent commentators had various reactivities to things like the Karma Sutra and various kind of misunderstandings and developments of that. And people were getting kind of hedonistic and kind of funny with their romantic relationships, exploitative, objectifying, not hygienic, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's all sorts of commentaries that are like, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And it's all very specific, like no having sex on hard ground. And you're like, all right, what? Did the Buddha really get that specific? No, he didn't. That was a specific situation and it was about, whoever was on the ground was getting harmed, because ouch. Yeah. So, there's things like that where we take it as, oh, that's from the Buddha, when in fact there's like a core teaching that was from the Buddha, and then we're used to hearing these various commentators as if it was the Buddha. And they had their own audience and their own time and place, and they were addressing particular things at particular times. And so we just kind of want to always be able to weave back to what did the Buddha say? And then the commentaries that we rely on, where were they coming from? Who were they speaking to? Were they speaking to monastics? Were they speaking to lay people? Were they talking to a king in a kingdom with lots of rich people, or were they talking to peasants in the fields and lots of poor people? It's helpful to know context. So anyway, that's what I wanted to flag. This is where this particular set comes from, is the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, which is popular in the Sanskrit tradition. Okay. So we talked about this one, praising yourself, belittling others, out of attachment to receiving offerings or admiration. Another translation of this vow is, if out of attachment to material gain and honor, you praise yourself and belittle someone of good qualities, it is a root downfall of praising oneself and belittling others. So generally, we analyze non-virtue on the basis of different components. For instance, there is the basis, the attitude, the performance, and the conclusion. So here, we can apply similar analysis to the root downfalls and the acts that lead to them. So thus, there would be a basis of who is speaking and the person spoken to. So someone who is capable of understanding the meaning of what is said. So you can only really belittle someone if they understand you. Then the motivation or the attitude, you're motivated by attachment to material gain or honor. So you want to get stuff, or you want to get accolades, or you want a good reputation. You're motivated by attachment to break this vow, of course, with the 4 complete. So you think you stand to gain by praising yourself and belittling others, whether materially or in terms of the esteem in which others will hold you. If thinking that you stand to gain, you go ahead and praise yourself and belittle others, you incur this root downfall. It's divided into 2, the praising and the belittling. Yeah. So when we see a vow like this, we just kind of unpack it. And it's usually quite logical when you unpack it, and you might not even need to look at the commentary to know what it means. But for something like this, it's helpful to know what affliction is being addressed. What affliction is being addressed? Here, attachment is being addressed. So attachment always includes some kind of exaggeration, right? It always includes some mistaken assumption. It's, of course, driven by ignorance, etc. But why do we praise ourselves? Why do we belittle others? Where is that coming from? When does it happen? So that was your mission for the previous week. Some of you may have chosen to take it up. How did it go to kind of flag that one in awareness, even if just for a moment here and there throughout the week? Was the first step noticing that lots of other people do it all the time? Or that is the basis of many conversations? I don't know.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start.
Yeah.
That one's always been a little more difficult for me, which is kind of worrisome, because praising oneself and praise can be, I mean, that's in other teachings has been like the most common thing people do. So I was really a little worried on it. And still this week I thought about it again, and really it's still more difficult me. I mean, I don't see myself praising myself. I'd have to think, really back in a different kind of context. But like the belittling others, I think of that in the sense because of being in work environments and stuff in terms of like you're just saying, if it's gossip or not. And I liked what you said that first night, it's you're discussing like the behavior. And that was when you said like the behavior of people, that was really key for me because I know at times I'm wondering, am I gossiping or not? Like, or I'm talking to my mom. I'm like, I remember being clear with my mom once, like, Mom, yeah, we're talking about my sister right now, but it's like there's a behavior really, because so I got a little sensitive on that, is it gossip or not? But I think that behavior thing was a good thing. Now the belittling, I couldn't think of an example recent, but anyway,
I
I
mean,
got me gossip.
yeah, it's good that it gets you thinking. I think that it's so common we don't even realize how often we do it. Like, say you're driving with another person, you park and you go to the grocery store, and who you've parked next to you parks too close to you. And you go, ah, that guy, he's crossed over the line. What's wrong with him? Why can't people park properly? I never do that. Done, right? Vow, transgressed. Right? Like we do stuff like that all the time where we're annoyed about something someone does. We say it in a way that is very much attacking the person and then immediately say, and I would never. I would never, right? I mean, you have to be really brutally honest with yourself. Like how much it's like you're not going, oh, that guy must have been busy, so he crossed over the line when he parked, or oh, that's a bad parking job. Anyway, I mean, you can be annoyed. You're allowed to be like, I wish that wasn't the case. Yeah. But we so often do something where, how dare they? I would never. How dare they? I would never. How dare they? I would never. And it's like, really? Why? Why do we need to talk this way? Why do we need to talk this way? So we don't think that we're like plotting for gain when we say that, but we are wanting to be seen in a certain light. Yeah, we're wanting whoever is hearing us to think that we're good or competent or something. We're wanting something about reputation. So it might be less common for a nice, polite person to be seeking personal gain, like material gain, by kind of showing off or having bravado. But definitely regular, nice, polite people fall into that trap of how dare they? I would never. Yeah.
Good
Yeah,
example.
Brenda.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Brenda, go ahead.
Yeah. Just first, a quick comment about that. I often used to get cross about people parking over the line until one day I saw I'd done it myself and thought, oh, Brenda, no. So I was quite shocked with myself because I thought I was a perfect parker.
Right. They
But
didn't
what
put the trolley away in the trolley area.
what I wanted to mention was, to me, there seems to be a difference between the word criticize and the word belittle. And
Yeah.
you mentioned this last week. It was something I was going to say right at the end, and then there wasn't time. That criticize seems to me to be more about the behavior. I may be wrong, but that's my interpretation. Whereas belittle is trying to humiliate someone and really wanting them to feel stupid or incompetent or inadequate or whatever. And that seems to me to be much, much stronger and to be
Yeah.
rooted in anger.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think it depends on the context, and I'd have to look at the Tibetan to see if those words are used interchangeably or if different words are used. I'd have to go back to the text and pull out the dictionary and check. Um, so I'm not sure because in the tantric vows, there's things about avoiding criticizing this or criticizing that for a particular purpose, and what they mean is from a place of belittling, not from a place of calling out a behavior. And there's a clear division of good criticism, bad criticism. And the bad criticism sounds like belittling. So I don't know if it's an English translation issue, but certainly there's something in terms of how we sit with it, where we need to get really clear of when we're discussing something we don't like, or when we're discussing something that seems harmful or problematic, why are we saying it? Are we saying it from a position of problem solving? Are we saying it from a position of just needing to vent a disturbance, but we're not attributing it to a person being faulty, just a behavior being less ideal? Or are we just, whinging, you know? And it's tricky because these are such habits. Like I think about when I'm visiting my folks, we like to talk about politics. We like to talk about politics in my family, and that can get really bad really quickly, even though we all agree. So it's like, why are we even talking? We already agree. We're just like pumping each other up. And sometimes we're clarifying, like, oh, this legislation would help this, and this legislation would help that. And we're having like good conversations about ideas and ways we can have a better society and who we should vote for and stuff like that. But a lot of the time, we're just like annoyed at a politician. And, we'll start with, okay, this policy is harmful. This policy is bad. We definitely need to make sure people know about this policy not being as good as it sounds. But it's so easy can turn into, and they're a jerk, right? And what's more, what's more, what's more? And it becomes like personal attacks. And, there's a member of my family who very quickly goes to physical appearance attacks of someone whose policies they don't like. And I'm always trying to like say to them something like, okay, but like it's not their fault that they're overweight, or maybe it is their fault. Who knows what's going on with their thyroid? Who knows what's going on with their metabolism? Their weight is none of our business, but their policies are. Right? Can we talk about their policies and not their weight? Thank you. And it's funny because like it's so easy to get on the bandwagon of, because I don't like these policies, I'm going to find lots of other things that I can be negative about. And if we're on the Bodhisattva path, we need to cut that out. And we need to try and not feed it when we see others do it. So with this family member, like they're enough on the same page that I can gently say, can we not? Can we talk policies and not people's appearance? And they'll be like, okay, you're right. But with some people, it would just annoy them further if I said that. So I just keep my mouth shut. Right. So like, what is the invitation for correcting the behavior in others? It is so specific to the relationship. Every relationship you have is different, and every way you communicate is different. So you have to really feel it in the moment of, is this a time where I can encourage the conversation to elevate? Or is this a time when I just need to try not to make it worse? And you just have to read it in the moment, but at least not make it worse. Yeah. Yeah, so just kind of thinking about, why do we say what we say? Why do we say what we say, especially when it's something negative? Why are we saying the negative thing? And there's been all sorts of studies about the brain science of always going to the negative, and what it does to us is not healthy, right? So just because it's true doesn't not mean it needs to be said. Is there a problem-solving mechanism, or is there even just a commiserating kind of fellow traveler having some empathy thing? Sure, sometimes. Um, when I was working for a phone hotline for suicide prevention, who's, I bet lots of you have done such things. I was working for a suicide prevention hotline. Their advice was, let people say the whole story once. Yeah, and as soon as they start to repeat themselves, you can start interrupting and trying to invite different ways of looking at it. But sometimes you have to let them say the whole story first. And I thought that was an interesting technique, because sometimes we try and interrupt someone when they're on a roll, and they're just on a roll and they just want to say the whole thing, and you just kind of have to give them their time. But once they start to repeat themselves, then maybe there's an opportunity to ask questions that can maybe elevate it or bring them out of a hole. Yeah, it's interesting to explore. So what you do is different, but how you speak, that's something to really sit with. Why am I negative? Is it useful? Is it transgressing this vow? Am I looking for some ego satisfaction, even if I'm not looking for personal gain? It can be a little confronting, but it's an important one to dig into. Yeah. Yeah, are there any more thoughts on this particular one?
I've got quite interesting combination sometimes, because I'm criticizing myself, and because I'm fed up with everything, I start to criticize other people, and it gets even worse, because then everybody so-called fuck up the whole thing, and
Yep.
it's like, okay, no chance, they didn't help me. I am not good, and everybody is like very tired with everything.
Oh, yeah, you're just in a whole spiral. Yeah. Yeah. And criticizing yourself, that's, it's tricky because sometimes you need to name ways you could behave better, but somehow it becomes really a weapon of self-abuse. Usually criticizing ourselves is not really about, oh, I shouldn't do this. I should do this instead. Moving on. Like it's not usually tidy and clean and strategic. It's usually some like just whipping yourself and telling yourself that you're bad. And it's not productive, and you have Buddha nature. Yeah, you can never ruin your Buddha nature. And it's actually much better to identify with your Buddha nature than your afflictions. Because if you think at your heart, you have this mind with infinite potential, and then you have all these silly mistakes and behaviors and things that you do wrong, they're extra, they're additional, they're removable, then you don't feel so kind of, in a way, attached to them or identified with them. So if you can just start with, my mind is trainable. My mind has infinite potential, just like everyone else's. That is who I am. And it's weird to place identity on potential because potential is not yet formed into something. It's potential, but it's actually closer to who you really are than all these surface things.
Yeah, just wanted to point that you can start with feeling better than other people, or you can start with feeling worse with the belittling thing, because
Yeah,
it's like two-way.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. How about no one is better than anyone else? Sometimes our behaviors are more or less skillful. How's that? Yeah. Or our behaviors are more or less problematic, but no one is better or worse than anyone else. That's a triggering thing to say, isn't it? Because you're like, what about so and so? They're worse than me. It's like, well, their behavior is less skillful than yours, perhaps, but it doesn't mean they're worse than you. They just have more problematic habits, maybe. Yeah.
I'm trying
Oh, sure.
to
Go ahead.
with I'm trying to at work figure out who can I be to act naturally, so I'm not gonna be this appointed holy being who always criticize people for criticizing. So I pick the fights, and sometimes I'll just keep quiet or leave or just smile. Otherwise, we had a discussion about death penalty. That's the time when I chose, I'm gonna say something. But other times I just say, oh, well, I cannot always be the one because then I will be the problem to the sort of the problem, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah, there's high stakes and low stakes conversations, and the low stakes one, is it worth your time? Will it help? There's later Bodhisattva vows that are about not correcting people when you have the opportunity to, but the key piece is when you have the opportunity to. It doesn't mean when you have the time to or the ability to. It's those things plus seeing there's receptivity. And so being able to see when there's receptivity is the skill, and to really like, when are they listening to me? And if it's something really important, sometimes the better strategy is to start with relationship building. Before you even say anything about anything, is to start with relationship building. How can I build trust and intimacy and warmth with this person? Then they will care what I have to say. We're used to thinking, oh, well, I can get them to care what I have to say if I have authority or dominance or aggression or a very convincing argument. And those might work in a limited way, but they usually bounce off soon, right? They don't usually stick. It's like the advice that sticks is from people whose opinion you genuinely care about, right? Not from people who you think you're going to get in trouble from. Then you'll just correct behavior to not get in trouble, right? It's not really a genuine behavior change. So starting with relationship building, it's like it's longer, but it's way stabler. I used to say this to some friends in Israel a lot of, if you can just keep coming back to who is right and who is wrong is a much too complicated conversation. Can you go back a step and feel some shared humanity? Because no one's going to get anywhere unless you can see each other, right? As human beings. And, it's like so much easier said than done. Like we can say it from a distance, but I mean, think of your own family and the conflicts that have been in your family for decades, maybe. and no one's got a window in, and they're just some stuck in dynamics. And if you're not in that dynamic, you can kind of be like, well, I see their side and I see their side, and sure, that side's rougher, but come on, guys, like, talk about it. But when you're in it, you just get this tangle. So if we're really wanting to improve communication, sometimes we try techniques of communication when really we kind of need to think deeper. How can I build heart connections? And then really the way you speak can be inelegant, it can be clunky, it can be all over the place and still be effective because the heart is felt. I don't know about you, but I've spent too much time in my life trying to say things just right. And that only works if there's receptivity, right? And if there's receptivity, you don't even need to say it right. You just need to say it from the heart and it works. So kind of going back to that like heart component when we're correcting others. Harder, but more stable. This one is an interesting one. This is also related to attachment, but attachment in the sense of miserliness. So the second one is, even though you're able, not giving material aid to others through miserliness, or not teaching Dharma to those who are suffering and without a protector because you want to amass knowledge just for yourself. So Khensa Rinpoche Geshe Tashi Tsering, he says, here the basis for refusing to give the Dharma or material assistance would be someone who suffers or who has no protector. That's the basis. So it's someone who needs it, right? It's not just random. So this is not inviting you to proselytize. It's not inviting you to like inflict gifts on people. It's people who need it, right? So even though it's appropriate to give Dharma or assistance to this person, you don't, due to miserliness. Thus, miserliness would be disturbing emotion in this attitude. The attitude in the first downfall involves attachment. This one involves miserliness. Generally speaking, miserliness is included within the class of attachment, so we could classify it as attachment. So this hoarding, it's this hoarding behavior. Sometimes it's when like you're really tired. This happens a lot. Like if someone asks you, hey, what are the Bodhisattva vows? And you're like, oh, okay, yeah. So the first one, and you don't really want to go through the hassle of explaining it to them, but they're asking you and they're open to it. And you're just like, can't be bothered. I'm too tired. I don't want to. So how do you navigate managing your own energy, being true to yourself, being kind to yourself, at the same time addressing a need and that unique moment in time when someone is actually asking, and what a gift it is when someone actually asks. So we don't want to be this like doormat person that's like, oh, I don't need sleep, I don't need to eat at regular intervals, I don't need to drink water, no, just suck me dry. Like, nah, that's not helpful. But it's kind of interesting to ask yourself, when do you rally? Yeah, you know this term rally, right? Like, when are you tired and then you snap out of it? What makes you snap out of it? Usually it's something attachment related, right? Like you got home after work, you're tired, you put your feet up, you're drinking a cup of tea or whatever, and you're kind of like done for the day. But then if someone says, hey, guess what? This cool thing you like to do is happening and I will drive you there, suddenly you'll perk right up, right? But if someone says, oh, guess what? The water heater just burst, you might be like, oh, okay, I got to sort out the water heater. And you'll kind of like find some energy to get it done. Yeah. And you'll like rally. So you can rally from a place of attachment and enthusiasm, or you can rally from a place of just like need and exasperation. Neither of those are what we're talking about. It's like, how can you tap on energy that exists without draining the tank? So there's the bodhicitta energy is what we're trying to build every day, all day, just kind of in the back of our mind. My life has purpose. My purpose is to develop this mind, to overcome suffering of myself and others, to build happiness for myself and others. It can look a million different ways on the way to Buddhahood, but how wonderful it is to have a life with meaning. And just kind of like having that as your worldview, it becomes much easier to turn towards people who ask. as soon as you lose your bodhicitta motivation, it's much more jarring to turn your attention towards someone who asks. It takes more effort. It's like the gears got rusted. Yeah, whereas when you have bodhicitta, it's like all the gears got well oiled, and you can just flexibly turn and address what is needed. So less bodhicitta often means less energy and more kind of stiffness in turning towards others.